Oh, yeah. Well, what do you want? Do you want everything just so?
Well, then there's the Chicago artist too.
All right. Well, last time we spoke about creation from the backside, so to speak, the side of ignorance, crystallized in various grades of matter, and of chaos and disorganization. We talked about the children of night, and in the second generation, the children of strife. And to recapitulate, we spoke about the children of night and the children of strife as representing progressively deeper states of matter, and the matter itself was a potential for living in, and that those states of matter were stated in terms of progressive degradation of consciousness, human consciousness, into deeper and deeper degrees of ignorance and ignominy and suffering. It doesn't really mean that we have to be degraded into baser states by penetrating deeper and deeper into matter, but it certainly means that we have to go into deeper and deeper states of congealed ignorance, and we do have to experience, and that experience is often painful. Even our best and most pleasant perceptions are developed out of pain. Really, truly, if you take it on the cellular level, even being touched or stroked on the cellular level, that's like pain. And it takes a general overall internal intelligence to recognize that there is love there. We're going to return to that side of creation, the descent from chaos, or the descent from night from time to time. Only now it's time to look at the descent from cosmos. And the descent from cosmos usually comes from Gaia. It's almost exclusively from Gaia. And the origin and the name of Gaia, the meaning of it, is a matter of some question. Some people think that Gaia herself descended from chaos. Hesiod, as we've been using as a textbook for original source matter, feels that way. He feels that Gaia is the daughter, or is born from chaos. This would have everything, the children of night and the children of Gaia, all being born out of chaos. Others feel that all four, three males, Chaos, Tartarus, and Eros, along with Gaia, just appeared in the beginning of things. Doesn't make much difference, because we're dealing with the Olympic creation, which is not so fastidious. If it is true, as Hesiod says, that Gaia descends from chaos, that would mean that Gaia is a sister to night. Both Erebus as dark night and Nyx as mother night. So that three of them would be triplets: Erebus, Nyx, and Gaia. This fits in with the general dualistic cosmology or cosmography of all of the Indo-European nations, that there was always a close association with the feminine, with earth and matter, as well as with darkness and with night, because Gaia is considered an earth goddess. It does have some sense about it, especially to people who are of the attitude that the only reality and the only light and intelligence is to be found in spirit, and because it is unpleasant, relatively speaking, to be in matter, they would eschew matter as being evil altogether. That is one of the concepts that early mysticism had to deal with, the tendency to try to escape any interaction with matter because it was wrong. And it got to be that the mythographers who told the story, being of mystical or poetic inclination, came to espouse that, and they skewed the stories to have that quality. Well, that's not what we really want to get into. The name Hesiod uses two different names. One of the names is Gaia of the wide breast, and the other is Earth. Like chaos, Gaia is capable of virgin birth, and she has 3 children. Firstborn is Uranus, who is a male, and his name means either King of the Mountains or Sky God. His sister, the second born, Rhea, is queen of the mountains or hills. And the younger brother is Pontos. I'm not certain of the translation, but I think it is the Salt Sea. As in the Hellespont, in the Sea of the Greeks. Immediately this presents us with perplexities. We have, if we look at it in one way, Gaia is Earth. But Uranus, her son, is the sky god. And her daughter, Rhea, is queen of the mountains, at least. So out of earth we have sky being born, and we have sea being born. And this presents some very interesting questions cosmologically. One of the questions is, how do we interpret? What levels of depth do we use to interpret these early births? And the order of the creative elements. Usually, the order of the creative elements goes from the most rare to the most dense. So that fire is the first produced, and air is the next produced, and then water. And then finally, the effect of fire and air on water causes a nebular precipitation of earth. This is very unusual because we have earth, or a kind of earth, being born first, and then from the earth, the air or the sky is born, and then the mountains between the sky and the earth, and then finally the sea. So apparently this is not meant, this represents something a little bit different than an elemental creation. There's something else that's going on here, and it's not to be taken too taken too literally. Yes, same being as the modern Uranus. We're going to have quite a bit to say about it tonight. I had a tough time putting together the notes because I had forgotten things that over the weeks that I had wanted to put into the notes, and desperately tried to remember them, but they will come back as needed. And then I got into some very speculative subjects. In fact, this is going to be one of the more speculative talks that we have, and it's going to be on some of the more difficult subjects to talk about. So if we look at this, we can look at it on various levels of depth. If you remember several years ago, when we started talking about the mystery of Demeter and Persephone, we looked at that as the Neoplatonists looked at it. And the Neoplatonists had 4 levels of depth to the interpretation of every myth, or at least 4. And we looked at 3 levels of depth, and then later on we did a 4th level of depth when we came to Orpheus. In this case, I don't think that the myth, at least as it is presented in the Hesiod form, is worthy of that kind of interpretation. But if you take sky god or king of the mountains, meaning superseder of the mountains as sky god, and queen of the mountains, this is where the word Oreads comes from. Are you familiar with Oreads? Oreads were the nature spirits, the large intelligences that overshadowed an entire mountain and interpenetrated it with their consciousness, and everything from the crystals and the gnomes that cut the crystals to the trees and the fairies that took care of the trees lived within the consciousness of an Oread. And an Oread was a large-scale nature spirit that overlooked all the life of a mountain. The Greeks had many categories. They had Nereids, which we're going to come up to later on, which were nature spirits that covered areas of the sea. And within their consciousness, they directed the consciousness within various areas of the sea. I have some conceptions painted by seers who have looked at those things. But these names, as presented, are very prosaic nature names. And you could say, if you wanted to be a little bit shallow about it, you could say that, you could rationalize and say that all of the gods were personifications of forces and states in nature. This has been done, and it is frequently done by science-y types now, who are subject to the materialistic superstition, and in that materialistic superstition, there's nothing to the myths. This is just a bunch of primitive people, and these primitive people gave names to things they didn't understand, and in their insecurities they superstitiously named them after gods. That's the atheistic natural science types that do that. It's a shallow outlook, and certainly wouldn't give us much for interpretation. If we took that, we could just take the names themselves and enumerate them, and we wouldn't discover very much about ourselves. Of course, to the materialists, they would realize that in order for us to understand something of the external world, be it the external material world or the external emotional world or whatever, we have to have it in ourselves. Because unless we have that reality in ourselves, there is no communion and no possibility of understanding something completely apart from ourselves. Because if it's so foreign, there is no connection. In fact, the occult student takes the maxim that really, if we want to know ourselves, we have to look into the external world. And what we see in the external world is ourselves. But if we want to know the external world, we have to look in ourselves, because the internality of ourselves is found within the external world. And so we have to look at things a little bit more deeply. Is there anything wrong with the viewpoint of saying that the gods are just nature forces personified and given human characteristics? No, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a little shallow, and it may not be completely true, but there's really nothing wrong with looking at things in that way. In fact, it can even serve a purpose. Because if people were, as the very early Greeks were, they had more clairvoyance than they had perception. And they had trouble coming into matter. That's why all of the states of matter, as we saw the last time we met, were given very onerous names or very ugly titles, such that to think of coming into incarnation or enjoying the world and giving ourselves to it and seeing a great beauty to it, it wouldn't be a very common thing. However, if we have this kind of view that God is in the worlds and that we can look at the mythology or we can look at the world mythologically, so that we see divine intelligences even in simple material activities, that's perfectly fine to get people to experience this world. Because mythology does have the purpose of guiding the consciousness of people. And people's consciousness, if directed to the material world as something divine, they're going to follow that. And the experience will be much more full and will be much more eager to do our duty. Okay, we'll start working our way in the direction of answering the other question, and we're going to get sidetracked a lot. And the other question is why the order of apparent production of elements that occurs in this cosmogony. Why is earth produced first and then air? Some cosmogonies have both extremes produced at the same time, fire and earth, or fire and water, and that in the interaction intermediary or other elements are produced, and in which case we can see very clearly a polarized condensation. But first, in order to understand that, we have to understand what and who Gaia is. To say that Gaia is Earth is not very understanding. It doesn't give us a lot of understanding. How would you much differentiate her from Oria, her daughter, who is the queen of the hills, which is Earth itself, or her granddaughter, the wife of Kronos, Rhea? Her name means Earth also. Clearly, there are different kinds of Earth. To the ancients, one of the uses of the term Earth is substance. Just in general, substance or matter. Another use is dirt. That is the what we walk around on, which is a very specialized kind of substance. Another is anything solid. Another is planet Earth. The mystery schools, while they did sometimes discuss these things, when they spoke about Earth, they were talking about none of these. Isn't that nice of me to give you this big long list and have the answer be none of the above? When the mystery schools talked about Earth, to them it represented what we would call the entire orbit of the Earth. The entire orbit. All of the stations, the east point, the west point, as we go around the sun, or as it appears the sun goes around us, at different times of the year, different constellations or different signs of the zodiac are opposite or behind the sun. So the entire orbit represented Earth. However, the space between the sun and the orbiting planets, because the mystery schools, like the Orphics especially, the Pythagoreans and Platonists taught that the sun was the center of the cosmos, but the space was not empty between the sun and the earth. It was full. It was a plenum, or a plenum, a full space. And it had all kinds of stuff in it. Not just particles, as science teaches now, but energy and all kinds of stuff and all kinds of relationships of stuff. So the modern mystic, for example, Max Heindel, often represents the Earth in different positions, and it's very clear that the entire orbit is indicated by Earth. But the mystics took it even further. They didn't mean the orbit of our planet only. They meant the entire ecliptic. So in short, Earth represents materialized solar system. From the viewpoint of our planet. Now, that's a really interesting view. It's like saying then that the different seasons, the different corners of the orbit, represent entrances into different areas of the Earth. And that, so the whole seasonal change was seen as an internal process, almost like we were passing through different regions of space. And those different regions of space had different qualities, and those qualities were reflected in the activities that took place on the surface of the Earth at that time. The mystic would carry it even further and say that different regions of space would have more than just mere material changes, but that there would be spiritual qualities according to the emanations of the sign of the zodiac that would be opposite from the sun, which would be the sector of the solar system that the Earth would be traversing at any given time. And so that there would be an inward and outward quality filling that plenum of space that was very much differentiated, and that the Earth was all of that. Now, it's not difficult if you consider the shape of the Earth's orbit as being an ellipse. An ellipse is egg-shaped. So if this takes us exactly right back to saying that Gaia is both Earth and egg, and that the whole of the solar system, that plenum that the Earth is in, is an egg, and it's an egg of creation, and this is where all things come to pass. So it isn't just the Earth that we're walking on, but as opposed to the spiritual intelligence that creates it and inseminates it, this is very different from the conception of a chicken laying an egg. Because the words that are used by occultists, that when a new solar manifestation is performed, divinity, or the divinity that we call God, selects an appropriate region of space. And the appropriateness of that region of space is relative to other stars. That the background of the different creative forces being emanated from different star patterns in constellations and such like that gives a quality to space, so that one region of space is very much different than another region of space. And that if a star is born, it is born in an area that is a suitable environment to it. And so it's very much like a human being. When a human being is born in a rainforest in the Amazon, they are born there because this is what their character needs. The only difference between this and God choosing a place to manifest a system for new experience is that in the case of God, the selection is with completely self-conscious awareness, and it is wisely chosen. We have those things too. It's sort of like suddenly we get a yearning for a certain kind of food that we really need. In the wintertime, I get a yearning for oranges, and I eat a lot of oranges. In fact, I eat mostly orange foods in the winter, carrots and oranges. And I guess for me it represents the orange sunlight that has been frozen into things that give me what I can't get from the sun externally. I get from it by taking it in the form of food. So we're talking then about an egg that is formed within the consciousness of divinity as it interpenetrates and impregnates it with its consciousness. And it's not an egg that is laid. It's very interesting in this regard that the firstborn of the triplets that are born to Gaia is the sky god. And Gaia, while she is of a wide breast and continuously creating, the first thing that is produced is the airy element. It's like saying that what was within Gaia was precipitated, and in the precipitation there was a differentiation of all that was subtle and rare in Uranus from all of what is becoming solid. And that is to say that the intelligence and the waking consciousness and the active creative quality that is represented by Uranus, by its differentiation, it is born as part of the crystallization process. You know what I'm trying to say? It's sort of something that, like what we were talking about last time, that we become ourselves by understanding what we are not. It is a subtractive method. It is a method that is by elimination. And that when the active creative Uranus is born, and there is then the precipitation of the earth, out of the union of heaven and earth, that the matter comes into being, and that matter which is not the intelligence, Uranus represents the manifestation of the intelligence that interpenetrates the egg, that is born at the same time that what it isn't is being condensed. So this is the reason that the sky is born out of earth. We're not talking about degrees of solidification, like from fire to air to water to earth, but we're talking about the sky being associated with creative active intelligence, and that creative active intelligence is born at the same time that there is a precipitation of dense earth. By what we are ignorant of and what we don't know about, our self-knowledge is born at the same time. I don't know how to say this, that taking the line that we took earlier, that we can't understand the earth unless we look at what happens outside of us, unless we look inside of our own being. So then when we look inside of our own being, then we know the meaning of things outside of us. And we discover ourselves in those things. And there is that bipolar, bidirectional understanding. And that's like saying that self is born at the same time that there is a new realization of self. There is a new realization of the extent of ignorance. Every time we discover something, we realize that there are a whole bunch more things that we don't know. And we have expanded our consciousness, and we have become more manifest in self, but in that there is that much more that is condensed, that hundreds of questions come up so that we don't know the meaning of. And something like that is the relationship of air and self being born out of earth. Now, there's another more sophisticated way to look at the whole process, and that is the Creator comes to light in the act of creation. That if you sit down to write even the smallest essay, or to do a drawing, in that process, you come into being as a creative being at the same time that you produce the object. It is a principle of transcendence, and it is the principle of transcendence that is behind all spiritual awakening. It is the principle that is behind all spiritual exercises. In the Rosicrucian school, we learn a simple exercise of concentration. And in that simple exercise of concentration, we, through the process of thinking, full thinking that involves meaning as well as imagination, we produce in the imagination a thought form. Very often it is a simple graphic thought form like something we see every day. Often if we're preparing for doing healing work, we visualize or recreate in our imagination a rose, which rose we will eventually interpenetrate with energy, and which rose is made out of energy. In the process of doing that imaginative thinking, creating a visible thought form, something happens. We discover who the thinker is. That the process of concentration automatically wakes one up to self, in the transcendent sense, to a baptism by the Holy Spirit, you might say. Because we, as spiritual beings, as spiritual selves, or as spiritual egos, are thinkers. And that in the process of thinking, we not only create thoughts, but we awaken and transcend our consciousness into the realm of the thinker, which is a much bigger kind of consciousness, which is a consciousness of meditation. Ultimately, that in the process of meditation, when we find a commonality between all meditations, we transcend to a contemplative state of consciousness where we realize ourselves in a spiritual commonness with all creation. That happens to be the noetic noeric, which is, as we remember from the Platonistic cosmogony, the realm of life spirit, or the realm of Christ consciousness in the Western mystery school. So the principle is, and it's a principle that works very well in understanding the relationship of Uranus and Gaia, is that successively we come into our own true spiritual being as we precipitate deeper and deeper states of material consciousness. That by doing the creative work, we become greater and greater creators with more and more completed and ramified creations. So, in this regard, it's easy then to see that Uranus represents a realm of intelligent light, a realm of lively, creative, intelligent light that is much different from the silver egg, or born out of night, born out of darkness, born out of the proto-creator of the noetic, that this is a creative light. Now, it's necessary, this whole process, once begun, must be carried on, because the creation must be continuous. We remember that Gaia and her children are sisters, the children of chaos, night in various different forms, so that they're cousins, you might say, from the children of night. Last time we left off talking about the dot game, wherein once we started noting that putting dots down and not trying to reproduce a pattern, but trying to always avoid producing a static pattern, we noted that when we once start that process, it has to continue. Because anytime we stop, that becomes a pattern. As long as we're continuing, that all of the patterns, all of cosmos, we recognize if we put the dot here, that's going to make this kind of pattern. And that recognition produces the pattern. And that's how creation begins. Creation begins, or cosmos, which is organization, begins by being the rejects from seeking a perfect chaos. That is to say, we can't do this, because if we do this, that'll be a pattern, and then it won't be unique. Chaos won't be unique. There can only be one chaos, because if there were two, then they would each be a pattern. They would be duplicates of each other. Now, once this process is begun, we're looking at two sides of God, two sides of creativity. We're looking at the chaotic side, and we're looking at the cosmic side. This means that it is absolutely necessary for the gods to create, because they have to stay alive. They're constantly seeking for the ideal of the perfect chaos, and that perfect chaos must always be alive, and it must always be creating. And so creation becomes a necessity. Anything that's going to live must create in the divine sense. So, if we look at the states of creation, or of cosmos, or of order, or of organization that are precipitated as afterthoughts, you might say, to the chaotic creation, which continues on and on and on, we see that there are differential states. We can't say that they're elements, but we have something rather earthy and something in between that is salty, as a sea-like, a salt sea, and we have something that is the sky itself. That is something that is much more rare. And then we're talking about the firstborn, the secondborn, and the thirdborn. That there's something intermediate in Aurea and something more definite in Pontos. And we're talking about a layered, that we're not talking about a graphic differentiation and a graphic creative difference between earth and air, or between Gaia and the children of Gaia. We're talking about something that is indistinct. And this indistinction obviously didn't last, because if the indistinction had lasted, we wouldn't be as we are now. We're pretty distinct, and we're pretty discrete. In fact, relative to the realms of Uranus, Aurea, and Pontos, we're extremely distinct, to the point so that it's almost a monstrosity to that type of consciousness how distinct and separate we really are. So it didn't stay that way. Now, what produced the difference? Remember when we went through all of the gradations of proto-creation when we looked at the Orphic cosmogony? We saw all of these states, the distinction between darkness and night, and darkness and silver light versus golden light, and those all represented very rare and very subtle vertical changes in consciousness and logical states of becoming. This is the same thing that is happening here in the Olympic cosmogony. It's very much like the Orphic cosmogony, only it's stated in terms that are not really sophisticated, and because it was done by poets. And poets get great insights and inspirations, and that's the way Plato felt anyway. They get great insights and inspirations, but they don't necessarily work out all the logic, and they don't have all the connections like the seers do. And so the Orphic cosmogony was developed by seers, and even though it was told like a story, it had a lot of esoteric meaning, which we're trying to look into. All right. Now something happens that produces the distinction in the Olympic cosmogony, so that things don't remain in these indefinite, indistinct states. Okay. All right. Another generation, it is what happens so that the cosmos becomes more definite. Because at the level of creation that is represented by Uranus, if we take our rarest intuition, which appears to us as the light of truth, it goes even beyond an idea. It's the general light of truth. It's when we know in our heart that something is true and we don't even know why. To our consciousness that we experience in an everyday sense, it is irrational. From a spiritual point of view, the experience of the life spirit, which is the plane of Uranus, in that we would find commonality with modern Christian mysticism, along with the Orphics and along with the Olympic cosmogony, that there is that common view. That light of truth, which is common to all things that are true, sort of like when the lights go on when we have a creative idea, how that becomes precipitated into creative ideas. Those creative ideas come on the next level, and that is the next generation. There are a few things in between that we're going to talk about, but we won't get to those until next time. But the next generation, as we see, it can't always happen by virgin birth. Because what happens is, once we have differentiated creation from chaos, organization from disorganization, the known from the unknown, and even a proto-light from darkness, once we've made that distinction, we have produced a polarity. And all of the polarities must then, all of the creation from then on must take place within polarity. Now the problem is that the polarity at this point, because it is so rare and everything is so much in union, that the polarity has to be vertical rather than horizontal. Which means we come back to one of the old themes again that we discussed when we talked about Hindu mythology, the problem of incest. And we're going to discuss incest tonight, and we're going to discuss homosexuality, and we're going to discuss a whole lot of other things, only a little bit, that we're going to discuss of them. What happens is Gaia unites with her son Uranus. And out of that union, we won't put them down this time, out of the union of Gaia and Uranus become 3 broods of offspring that form the next generation. But we want to leave that for now. We want to talk first about incest, which is a very germane topic. Why is there so much incest in the world right now? We call it by a different name. We call it, what do we call it now? Child abuse. Parental child abuse, sexual abuse by parents and priests and teachers and other pedophiles. In this case, it is familial incest. Now, there is a big difference. Prajapati pulls his daughter from his side. And when he has pulled her from his side, he externalizes her and looks at her, and she is beautiful. And he wants to unite with her. And she leaves her first position and moves to another position. And he looks at her and stops her dead in that position. And she tries to escape from that position and moves to yet another position. And this is repeated 4 times until the point where we find that Prajapati, which is another name for Brahma, has 4 faces. And those 4 faces, each one looks in a different direction at one of the static positions, that crucial turning positions that his daughter took in trying to escape him. Now you notice the similarity of the myth. If Earth is indeed the entire orbit of the Earth and is indeed the entire solar system or ecliptic plane in which the creation takes place, there are 4 turning points in the Earth's course, in the elliptical orbit that we are in, that mark the differences between winter, spring, summer, and fall. And those turning points are like the 4 faces of Prajapati. And those are on the material plane. Those are very low reflections of the principle that takes place on the transcendent level when the egg is hatched in the cosmic level that we're talking about it now. In the case of the Greeks, in the Olympic cosmogony, instead of a father uniting with his daughter, we have a mother uniting with her son. Interesting. Each one has a different kind of character. First, we'll try to look at some of the common characters, and this is going to be very slapdash. I spent a lot of time trying to think this out in such a way that I could make statements that wouldn't be generalized and scandalize me and the world, but yet at the same time not spend 10 lectures talking about incest and 10 lectures talking about homosexuality, which I would like to do sometime, but don't know if I shall, because they're very, very, there's a lot of need for it. Now, these are problems on the human level and on the divine level that require great sensitivity and they require great comprehension. And the speaker, me, feels that he has neither the comprehension, because I don't fully understand these ideas, nor do I have the sensitivity. So I'm just going to blunder my way through making a few slapdash statements, and they may not be the most sensitive. And so you can say that this section where we're dealing with very touchy issues is going to be like all the rest of the course. I'm going to just shout here and there en passant as I go running through things that people have spent lives and lives pondering. Now, the prohibition against incest of any variety, sibling incest or parental incest, is a special case, and it's fairly recent in human evolution. In earlier times, when race spirits guided bodies of humanity to bring them certain kinds of physical and cultural lessons that became manifest in their language, in their dress, in their eating, in their music, all of the things that culture and the experience of the external world are made up of. In earlier times, the race spirits each had a specialized character, sort of like the 7 colors of the rainbow, making up the total of the visual spectrum, and something like the 7 primary planets in astrology, and people, in terms of their spiritual individuation, were weaker. And they were more wayward, but they were easier to keep in line. So the people were born or reborn into various different kinds of racial experiences in order to have different specific kinds of lessons. And that it was during the time of specialization. We're leaving those times now. We're going to greater generalization instead of greater specialization. And in times of greater specialization, we couldn't learn everything all at the same time. So we would be born in one culture to experience one kind of thing, and we would be born in another culture to experience another kind of thing, and another culture, until finally we had an understanding of the external world or life in a material body from various different points of view that give us a full spectrum understanding. At such times, incest wasn't frowned upon by the gods or by the creative hierarchs. It wasn't frowned upon at all. There was sufficient variety in the gene pool to protect against dangerous inbreeding, and because people weren't individualized enough so that they could produce radically different bodies. You know, like one of the products of, like for example, when it happened among the Habsburgs in Europe, it produced a lot of freaks, and it produced a lot of crazy people when incest was carried on. And this happened when more and more people became strongly individualized, and in that individuation became quite deviant, so far so that they could even become freaks and crazy people. That couldn't happen in the ancient times because the individualism wasn't that strong. So it wasn't any bar against incest. In fact, in some ways, incest helped maintain the commonality, you know, sort of like the way animals are bred now. Within a species, certain specific traits came out. But even in animals now, you inbreed them too much and you produce undesirable results there. So, and on top of that, the whole breeding process through religion and through the ethers themselves was controlled by the race spirits and by the cultural spirits, so that there was protection against freaks occurring, because they protected to see that it didn't happen. So you see like AT&T or Bell Laboratories is spending millions of dollars on biological research because they want to find out the secret of the genetic memory. Because if they can develop the secret of the genetic memory, then they figure they can have a memory for phone lines that you won't have to have massive data banks, that you'll just have just something really tiny and all that memory will be there. They're looking for it, as all materialists do, they're looking for it in matter, not realizing that the genetic memory resides in the ethers, which actually control the formation of matter and that are infinitely suited to bearing and holding impressions, whereas dense physical matter is very hard and resistant to taking an impression and holding it. So you couldn't have a memory of nature on the physical plane the way that you can in the etheric. So the race spirits could guard against freak mutations, as they do right now in the case of mules. When you take a horse and a donkey and cross them, you get a mule which cannot reproduce. Race spirits won't allow it. However, recently, in the last few years, it has let up, and now you can mix them. Same thing with other interspecies mixtures. More of that is being allowed, so that even in the animal kingdom, a time of greater differentiation is coming about. But there are problems, like there are with all experiments. Like, for example, what happens, that almost every city in the United States, and certainly every city west of the Mississippi, has coyotes in town. And the coyotes breed with German Shepherds. And I don't know what you call the result, a coyote. I don't know. Or a coepard or something like a coepard. But there's a problem with these animals, and that problem is how the etheric body fits into the physical body. Those dogs usually die, or those animals usually die at a very early age from progressive epilepsy. And the progressive epilepsy is because the etheric brain doesn't fit into the physical brain, and as there are ramifications and learning processes in the physical brain of the animal, the interface becomes more and more difficult, and eventually more and more spasms come in, and the animal dies of terrible epileptic spasm. All right, even in the different races and cultural groups, there were special genetic groups, such as the spiritual people who had to have the ability to leave the body. And so we find in the Orient, we find the Brahmins had that loose connection between the etheric and the physical body. And in the Bible, we read about the Levites, who were meant to be the priestly caste, that they had that loose connection. Going all the way back to Atlantis, the people who were chosen to become the leaders of humanity, you heard of divine kings or well-born people. That was started by the Venusians in Atlantis. They produced another hybrid case there, so that early in human development, there are, to this day, there are still illnesses that are called, there's one in Britain, that they still call it the king's evil, because only a true king who has the genetic quality, that is the relation to the inner worlds, that they can manifest energy and they can cure this illness. It's a test of both the king and of the illness. The diagnosis is that a true king can heal it, and that's the way you test a true king, is if somebody has this illness, it can be cured. What? I don't know what it's called. It's called king's evil. I don't think that there's much said of it anymore, because that relationship between king and subject is long gone. Now, with the individuation has carried things very, very far. It used to be that even in the area right here where all of the bones come together in the skull, that a special tuft of hair of a different color or of a different character was born in people that were in the line of divine kings. These are things that carry. This is where I think that old thing where that only place where you let the hair grow on the Hindus in the ancient, I think this goes back to that same thing. All right, so in all of these cases, in fact, in some cases, the priests who could leave the body and were sensitive to the ethers and the inner worlds, they actually had magical abilities. They knew how to do. There's Vedic birth control, where you knew how, when among the sun, the positions of the moon and the sun and such like that, you could produce a male child or a female child, and when a union would be fruitless, and they could actually control the injection of the etheric matrix into that it will be part of the seed atom of the physical body. They could control that so that it would or wouldn't be in the sperm. There's a birth control of that type. In fact, characteristics from generation to generation could be passed on, so that a lot of the Ptolemies of ancient Egypt, many generations before the Greek lineage came in, Cleopatra and such like that, those people had the ability to carry on amazing abilities, so that they were genius kings or genius queens, and they all the incest was very carried on to a very high degree. So you can see that at one time incest was not frowned upon. However, we as humans gradually developed soul power. The spirit became stronger, and individuation became stronger, unstoppable, and it became desirable, so that we each become a universe in ourselves, even though it represents a dangerous possibility of fragmentation carried on to tangential extremes where we could be thrown out of it all. Individuation was necessary so that we each became, so to speak, a divine race of our own. And so at this time, the gods, the hierarchs, the race spirits, the cultural spirits that guided us, introduced something new into mythology that made incest of all varieties taboo. There were many reasons for it. Number one, it not only made individuation possible, but it fostered it. Earl and I have read the writings of a man who was a biracial spiritual student. And he talks about the different etheric forces working in his bloodstream, and that there was a perpetual war different genetic materials in his bloodstream that caused greater and greater personal individuation, like it or not. We all know the social consequences that biracial children have to deal with, but it really does produce individuals who cannot identify, for example, in races between Afro-Americans and Aryan types. The offspring are accepted by neither, and they are forced into greater individuation. So that's one of the reasons why incest and interracial marriage were promoted. And it provided the way to obliterate all racial things. In the same way that the Rolling Stones are obliterating, all rock and roll is obliterating all of the old ethnic music, and McDonald's hamburgers are obliterating ethnic foods. Those are all helping the same cause that myths that frown on incest are also doing. So it is, the more those racial types are broken down, the less one can become an individual pitting oneself against culture. Because pretty soon there will be no cultures. And this leads to a very special kind of individuation. It leads to a non-comparative individuation, where one does not have to be a rebel standing against the suffocating forces of society or against the church or something like that. We're getting to the point that everybody is going to be a bohemian. Everybody is going to be so unique, and at that point, there's nothing to rebel against anymore. And then individuation must be seen for itself alone. Beautiful thing that is happening. And one of the things that began to bring this apart was taboo against incest. And it leads to a further state when we're all individuated, but yet we have something in common because we can talk to each other, even with the same language, because obviously if all of the cultural languages break down and there's all one language, I don't think it's going to be Esperanto. When it's all one language in all one culture, it won't be bland and blasé. Each one of us will be completely unique because that's what it's going to take to break down all of these cultural differences. Then we will discover not only a non-comparative individuality, but we will discover a unity and a commonness with everyone, with everyone having the same spirit. And so it's paving the way for the ultimate amalgamum where we voluntarily reunite with humanity first and ultimately the entire cosmos by accepting a oneness in which each of us are very distinct individuals. So these are reasons why it's such a great importance to become true individuals where we don't have to fight against the culture, but just be individuals in ourselves. And we can't possibly unite with all of humanity unless we overcome all racist tendencies, because those racist tendencies strengthen the hanging on to of the race consciousness, and the individuation can't possibly take place. Now, there's another reason why it's a psychological reason. This gets into something that is a very topical interest to us. a psychological reason why parental incest in particular became taboo. We all know that the consequence of parental incest is a devastating weakening of the character of the child that is involved in an incestual relationship. It's retarding to social growth and spiritual growth, and it sometimes even produces a retrogression in individual growth. And the really bad part about this is that it gives the child of such a relationship the notion that this is normal. And when the child becomes an adult, it's still weak. And considering it normal and having a need to assert some quality of strength, what does it do? It perpetrates it onto its own children. Now this led me into all kinds of fascinating speculations. It led me into believing that it's possible that the quality of all of the beings, remember this chart, we're going to be able to carry this chart from the one right down to every human being and every other being by successive generations. Well, none of the mythologies talk about the animals that I know of, but I'll look around, maybe I'll find it, is the product ultimately of incestuous, that is, vertical, bipolar differentiation. Is this the reason, or is this the modus operandi where there is a, how would you say it, transduction of spiritual strength into increasingly weaker beings, and with those increasingly weaker beings, there is a possibility for greater differentiation because there isn't so much bonding. And in that quality, one would think that the strength of God is attenuated and that the extent of the creation is the extent of the creative concentration of the divinity that can only concentrate things so far, and beyond that, that represents as far as the universe can be condensed. And that the successive weaknesses of the beings that need to experience that, because if they become weaker, then there is more of an experience from the external world that imparts itself. Whereas if we lived in a tautological solipsism, we could be very strong in ourselves and stay the same all the time. We must interact. But if we stay in ourselves, we become very strong in our own little world and we don't interact. And the same thing is true with the divine. And therefore, it must be brought to a level of weakness, and that is what the creatures do, especially at the far ends. And the consequence of successive generations of beings being born out of something like a cosmic incest leads the consciousness of God to be differentiated among all of these different beings to the point where they are capable of being overcome or no longer self-centered in strength, and so that through them the divine then has the interactions with something new, something it was ignorant of, that is congealed in matter, which takes us back to the dark side of creation. That's where my speculations went. I don't know if there's anything true to that, but the principle of incest being weakening is a very interesting one to me, and that's some of the sideline things that came out of it for me. From the mythical examples, the effect is analogous. We don't know much about the daughter of Prajapati, but we do know that Uranos, who through incest with his mother became weak. And as we're going to see the next time we talk, he became so weak that he was even castrated by his own son, Kronos. We're going to talk a lot about castration next time. We have a lot of things that we have to get into. Yes. I don't know. Venus is like that too. All of the planets are said to go through such a rotation, for example, that the astronomers don't agree with that, but spiritual astronomers claim that the Earth falls end over end. And if I'm not mistaken, the number of years as we reckon years now, that it takes for it to fall end over end without dramatic shifts, which do also occur from time to time, is equal to the number of stones that are in the Great Pyramid. All right. In order to develop freedom and autonomy, this weakness that is produced through incest may be necessary. In order for creatures to become differentiated without being under a strong control, first the weakening of incest has to occur before the separating, and then when there is experience in separation, there can be a turnaround. Now, it's really, there are all sorts of things involved in this, all sorts of principles that are involved in the process of incest producing weakness. At the same time, it's, what? Right, that's part of it. Yeah. And it allows matter to get a hold of us, and us to get a hold of matter, which is where new growth comes from. So that in the same way that there is a paradox between extreme polarization on the horizontal, where extremely masculine individualities in the male's body need extremely feminine individualities in a female's body. That on the horizontal, the polarization becomes complementation. But when it is on the vertical, it produces paradoxical opposites. Uranos becomes weakened by the incestuous relationship with Gaia, but in that weakness is to be found the seed of eventual great creative strength. So that the polarization, so that it produces a paradoxical kind of opposition that is different than like the male-female, which is horizontal. It produces a weakness that is at the same time the birth of strength. And at the same time that there is a weakness, one of the things that comes out of it with the birth of individuality in the case of human beings, if we look at the incest that had to be given up as people became individuals, always the projection of spirit into matter has always been called the fall into sin. even when it became sin, that is working against the divine plan for selfish reasons, for selfish ends. Through the weakness and the humility of incestuousness that produces the vertical differentiation, through that humility, ultimately is where the greatest strength in humanity comes from. That is the commonality that we all share in humanity that eventually becomes our great strength. And that all comes when we realize the human condition, when we have been separated so far from the independence, that has come about by what we're calling incest in the larger sense. It is also true that in the process, this is something that's going to carry into next week's talk a lot, or next time we meet, that in the process of creation, we project the dream. And that is people who are lonely and live by themselves alone, daydream a lot. And when we project dreams and step into them, even though we're weakened by that, and live them out for real, is the way we become stronger. It's the way we transcend. By living through our dream in incest that produces material interaction, when we live through the dream and play the make-believe for keeps, for real, we realize it. And we realize it by taking that ignorance and making it into knowledge by the experience of it from that we never knew. That's why the material world is such a great training school, because brute matter is ignorance that is becoming wisdom. It's things unknown that we, by our scientific, our artistic, our cultural projects, by our interacting with things, is the way we're taking something that is a sleeping wisdom or a sleeping potential and wakening it up. And in the process of giving ourselves over to our dream, we step outside of ourselves and we become ourselves, and we produce more of wisdom in the process. So there is a tremendous, tremendous power or realization that comes out of humility. Now, it doesn't have to be the humilification that takes place in human incest. I'm not at all speaking in favor of good things coming out of incest. There's much, much more in this whole principle if you want to. There's a lot of subtleties that you can dig into, but I didn't want to go too far with it. Otherwise, it would have been too difficult to byways. All right. Evolution, another way of saying the same thing or carrying the principle to where we want to go with it. Evolution, change, and progress necessitate inequality. If there is complete equality, like horizontal equality, there is no progress, no change. And so in vertical hierarchy, where some degree of incest is necessary, is where this inequality is produced. It's multifaceted. We as human beings, because we're limited, only see a few of the facets. this has to do again with that whole idea of cultural relevances. Different societies look at the same thing in different ways. What we're looking at right now, the Hindus were coming into a time, or coming away from a time, when those incarnated in the feminine body were dominant. They were the main force. And it was necessary for the pendulum to swing the other way. So in Hindu mythology, we have Brahma, or Prajapati, incestuous with his daughter. Now we're beginning to swing the other way, and we're moving toward a period of equality, on the other side of which the forms will again be that the feminine is dominant, and therefore in the later mythology, especially about the time when the Christ consciousness comes in, is when the incest is a mother with a son, which has the emasculation of the male. And so there is a timely reason, just beside cultural differences, just beside the different flavors of the colors of the rainbow, there is a temporal, a time reason why there had to be incest of one kind with the Hindus and incest of another kind for the Greeks. There's another reason for it, which we'll probably go into at another time. I don't want to get too bogged down with it here. That brings us now to another subject. It's another one of the subjects that is deep and very vast and been treated speculatively. And we're only going to cover one tiny little bit of it. And again, I'm talking beyond my own sensitivity and beyond my own comprehension. So if I say things that are offensive, just bother me with it. I'll develop my sensitivity. This is the subject of homosexuality. We're going to talk about not so much the psychological, not so much the physical or the hereditary. We want to talk a little bit about spiritual origins and spiritual ends of homosexuality. Neither to promote it or to down it. Uranus, as we have said, was not only weakened and emasculated, but it was eventually castrated by his own son. The broad, but not necessarily true implication is that there is weakening and transpolarization in the child. That is to say, one of the effects of incest is not only a psychological weakening, but a transpolarization of the child, so that homosexuality comes in. On a psychological level, this would imply exactly. So the consequence of the weakening and transpolarization would imply very much exactly like Freud that male homosexuality is due to the dominant, overpowering influence of the mother. Freud would say that this is totally due to the mother. Speaking from astrological and observational experience, I find that many cases, the mother's influence, dominating influence, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a strong mother. can be a weak mother with a weak child, or a strong mother applying herself in the wrong way at the wrong time, or in the wrong area, or in the area of greatest weakness of the child, is often a major factor in male homosexuality. Not exclusive, but very often a major. Again, I would say that from observation and from astrology, the character of male homosexuality in all of its varieties has as its parent principle expression of the forces or misexpression of the forces of an Uranian nature. That is to say, in some broad way, male homosexuality in the horoscope has to do with Uranus. So if we look therefore at overpowering conditions in the 10th house, or overpowering conditions of the moon, and an afflicted Uranian nature, and the kind of socialization to go with it, we have an archetypal homosexuality. It is tempting, more than tempting to me, to state for symmetry's sake that Neptune and the father play a similar role in female homosexuality. My observation and astrological experience is more limited, but it does carry this out. Please do not generalize these things, because if you find a woman with an afflicted Neptune, that does not necessarily mean that she is a lesbian. It's very dangerous to generalize, but the quality is there. This says, obviously, not only is there a big difference between being in a male's body and being in a female's body, but the response to the transsexual spiritual planet represents a much different psychology to male and female homosexuality. So there is a common transpolarization. There are both evolutionary and devolutionary aspects to both manifestations, males or female. One cannot say that any experience or any kind of activity is totally destructive, because out of every experience there is progress. The fact that the noetic, life spirit, plane of consciousness is causally and cosmologically antecedent to the human spirit, the realm of Neptune, it is clear then that in Uranus and in the myth of Uranus is to be found the antecedent source for all homosexuality, in the same way that the Uranian intuition has the Uranian type of seership, when brought to its fullest understanding, transcends that of the Neptunian. Very much like those states are called in the Orient, the Nirval Kalpa Samadhi is a much deeper spiritual awareness than the Sabal Kalpa Samadhi. Now, I don't want to say much more about this, but the same factors of weakness and strength that are to be found in incest are found in the causes that produce homosexuality. the same, how would you say it, social and cultural ostracization that is experienced by these individuals has the same effect of being a biracial child. It produces an enforced and very much rapidified individuation. It doesn't necessarily mean more compassion. It should, in the long run, mean more compassion, but if a person gets entrenched in the physics, in the physical body, and that form of differentiation, just as one can be entrenched in rebellion against society and not come into their own as an individual, as a creator, because their individuality is self-protected in that struggle, the same thing can happen with homosexuality. So that no matter what your views are about homosexuality, a strident struggle with it is likely to have the most inimical effects upon an individual going through that experience, because it's more likely to entrench them in the experience than it is to bring about the common human experience that can come out of it. Ultimately, it is the same sort of quality, that it results in a weakness that is the seed ground for an ultimate strength of a different kind. And it is a letting go in the material sense that results ultimately in a transcendence in a spiritual sense. We're going to have a lot more to say about some of those qualities the next time we get together. I have a lot of other things that I could say, because there are etheric and physical factors that enter into homosexuality, and there are different kinds of homosexuality. That the homosexuality that was of the Greeks had an origin in a much different kind of cultural experience, and it was associated with idealism, whereas Roman homosexuality was associated with materialism and with ennui and a need to have some new kind of experience. And clearly the consequences and the manifestations of the psychology of the two of those two flavors of homosexuality are very much different. It's a subject that we could talk on in other ways for a long time, but I don't want to go into it. The topic is going to come up again, especially the topic of restraint and release is going to come up again, and it's going to come up much more usefully when we talk next time about the children of Uranus and the ultimate castration of Uranus. And we're getting down to where we have not too many talks left for this year. We may not run all the way into May. So we'll meet in 2 weeks, and we will talk more about Uranus. I'm sure that opened up all sorts of questions and all kinds of speculative excitements. It did for me. I loathed having to deal with the whole subject because it's so hard and so many people can get hurt so much with it. And any time that you have to deal with vertical differentiation, you come into inequality that leads to snobbishness and superiority and consequent slavishness and discriminations from the vertical superior thinking that it is beyond, so much so that Lao Tzu didn't even want to think that there was was a greater man or a lesser man. As long as you think that way, you can't do anything. But I think it's just the other way around. That's the way everything is accomplished. But we must realize the necessity of the superior and inferior, and in that interaction, develop something. Because without that inequality, there would be no growth. Because there is, see, Lao Tzu's view of it was that if you have someone superior, that if you create a virtuous man, you automatically produce an unvirtuous man. For every saint there is a sinner. And I think that's wrong thinking, because the vertical always works by the principle of analogy. As above, so below. And when you work with the principle of analogy, or so below as above, that's a sliding scale. If you have someone who is more virtuous, you have somebody who is less virtuous. But it gives you a scale that you can aspire to something higher. And without that comparative differential, the whole scale can't move up and there can't be a progress. All of the things where there is too much of a tendency to a horizontal equality, everybody is equal and there's no progress because there's nothing to rise above and there's no one to look up to. Sure, there's the possibility of being looked down on and being enslaved, but there's no possibility of rising up. You know, a lot of people, by their slavish condition, have raised themselves by saying, I'm not going to let this happen to me. I'm going to get on top. And it is that verticality that progress comes through. All right. You had a question?
I had a question from way back at the beginning. I forget what it had. Oh, the various proliferation, the number of people on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if there was any
limit,
but we were talking about the patterns and the fact that once you got to a static point, then it became a fixed point, fixed pattern. Is there any correlation, or can you jump from that to the billions of people we have on the planet right now?
It so happens that there's the greatest commonality where the greatest masses of people are. And the individuals and the individuation is where you find there's much more minority in that. The population explosions occur where there is more sameness among people, because I guess they need more of the suffering that's going to cause greater differentiation. But even that's a risky statement to make, because there are reasons for different kinds of suffering for people who have attained to individuation. I'm not sure I'm answering your question. In fact, I feel I'm not. Would you state it again in another way so that I can hear it better and at least present a view on it? If you have more generations and you have more people, does that mean a general weakening? Yes.
No, I wasn't. See, the question occurred to me before we got talking about the incest and homosexuality, and it was more the I guess theory about
the diminution of strength.
No, the points. All of the points.
Oh, yes.
Okay, and the fact that with each point it being all random, okay, and therefore being created, all of the people, it seems to me, we're not replicating the earth. All of the people on the earth are
producing more patterns, or
more patterns.
Yes, I would believe that. That's why each one of us, I think that the principle and the counter principle eventually collapse on each other, so that there will be as many universes as there are evolving individuals. But it will be the same universe with many different unique points of view, so that the awareness eventually of the commonality and the unity going in one direction, the sameness will increase to the limit of the number of differentiations of universes. It's an experience that we all have inside of ourselves, that as we become odder and odder, we seem more and more different from the rest of the world. But inwardly we feel more unity with everyone and more acceptance of everyone, odd as they might be. So that the principle is cutting both directions at the same time. That's one of the paradoxes. That is, like the weakness, strength, the unity, differentiation comes about at the same time. Because there is, if you remember, only one chaos. And that one chaos is infinite, because it has to be infinite. It has to keep differentiating and becoming different from all of the possible organizations that come upon it, so that it would look in some regards all the same, but it would be actually very different. But if you start looking at all of the differentiations, it would seem like there were an infinite number of different kinds of patterns, and so the number of patterns that can be produced within chaos is infinite. But the chaos itself is singular. It's a singularity. It has to be. And that's again another part of the transcendence in the vertical, that as you get weakened by having to maintain a larger and larger structure of differentiations, there is also a strengthening in unity at the same time, in recognizing the oneness in the many of the same thing. Yeah. No, there's a finite number. Though I haven't counted them yet. No. Yes. Well, sometimes the population is high and sometimes the population is low. But it's the same people that are incarnating all the time. It's just that more of them are on the outer plane sometimes, and sometimes more of them are on the inner plane. And it depends. If my understanding is correct, the earth will rebel, meaning that the time will come when very suddenly there will be very many fewer incarnating at the same time. Yes. Some people think it will happen, and the major part of it will be done by 2001. Some people think that only 5% of us will be left by then. And I don't know whether I belong to the 95 or 5. All kinds of different things. I don't want to